let's let about a scenario where the GP agent is unable to connect when the authentication method is using both SAML and certificate authentication. So the requirement there is that the certificate and SAML authentication both should be used, and when it is set to yes, which means you can either use the SAML or say user credentials or client certificate, the GP connects. But when the option is set to no, which means you need to use both SAML and client certificate, the connection does not work. Now, in this case, if you log in to the Strata logging service and then you check the logs, you would see some kind of failure there where there is an authentication failure because of the username. In this specific scenario, if you are using SAML and client certificate both, usually there is a difference of username, because when using SAML, there is a certain format that most of the IDP providers by default have, which is your UPN format, for example, username at company.com. And when the IDP does the authentication, it returns the user, which is either UPN or let's say your company /user format. But if you are using a client certificate and the client certificate also has a subject field, and within that subject field you have either a username defined in either format, the GP will also extract the username from there. So they both has to match. If they're not matching, then there is a problem, because then you're doing the authentication for SAML or SAML or any other method, say LDAP, and certificate, and both have the username. So there should be no conflict between them. And either we need to make sure that the IDP returns the same format, which might be tricky. Otherwise, there is another option where there's no username field defined in the certificate profile. In the certificate profile, when you configure the certificate profile, there is a username field where you select that the system needs to extract the username from subject name. So if you don't do that, then the only way the username is derived is from the SAML, and then there's no conflict, which means that after, when you're using both SAML and certificate, easiest way is to not configure username field in the certificate, and then it'll just rely on the SAML, and then based on the SAML authentication, the connection can continue. There has been an enhancement in the web view for SAML authentication. When I say web view, it's for the embedded browser specifically. So the versions that are mentioned here, 609, 623, and 6.3 and above, they have been upgraded to the web view 2, both for Windows and web view 2 for Windows and web view for Mac OS. What this does is it basically makes sure that the embedded browser works better. So if you're using your older clients, and with time either the Mac OS upgrade has happened or the Windows has upgraded, the embedded browser for SAML might not work that good, or there might be some errors. So the latest GP client has that changed in terms of what web view from the system it uses, which works better for the embedded browser. Again, if you're using CIE, the Cloud Identity Engine and the Cloud Authentication, previously there was no support for embedded browser. As soon as you configure CAS or the Cloud Identity Engine for SAML authentication, it would use it was needed to use default browser only, but that's no longer the case. You can use the default browser as well. Sorry, the embedded browser as well with that, which will make sure that you can, if there is a requirement or there is a organization tendency that the default browser is better, so that the user gets a better, attention that they need to log in, that can be used. Another Another case study example is for iOS users. So there was an issue where for iOS users, there is a configuration where there is a welcome page. Like you can configure welcome pages for GlobalProtect, that once you're connected, you get a welcome page, and then that can be your home page, or that can be some informational details that you're connected to this secure network, and what you can do, what you cannot do, and so on. For specifically for iOS, the problem reported was that that connection is done, the welcome page does open, but it opens up in embedded browser, and that once that's done, the user cannot go back to a previous page. So the user, if the user clicks on something, they don't have an option to go back or do anything, and because of that, the communication is stuck. The GP is connected, but the user is not able to really do anything, because that embedded browser is not really designed for a much longer user intervention. It's only designed for your authentication. You authenticate, you do the MFA, and then you're done. Now, this is because due to Apple and iOS limitations, once the GP is connected, the welcome page is essentially not supported on iOS, because of that, it cannot the GP cannot open it in an external browser, and that's why it doesn't work. For Windows and Mac, you can still be using your regular SAML with embedded browser, but your welcome page opens up in your default browser, whatever is your default browser, and then it doesn't interfere with the user's communication or uh, the user's GP connectivity once the connection has been done. Now, when we compare embedded browser and default browser, both have different use case, and different organizations might have different views on which one to use. You can have different user groups or user bases, where you have default browser enabled for some, and embedded browser for some. It's controlled from app settings, where you can define a specific set of users who uh, for whom default browser works better, and for some embedded browser works better. So it is based on user perception. Typically, embedded browser means you connect to GP, you just get a prompt on your screen, which is within GP. There is a browser prompt which redirects to the IDP, and then you need to enter your credentials. Default browser, you have your Chrome, and then there's another tab within Chrome that opens up, redirecting to your IDP, and then you can authenticate from there. As we discussed previously, CIE was not supported with embedded browser, but it is now. There is one enhancement in 6.3 for captive portal as well, where if, let's say, there are users who travel, and they need to use captive portal a lot of times, for example, at airports, or outside in coffee shops, where the captive portal is required. Previously, the captive portal would go back to the default browser, even if you have embedded browser configured, which would be a different experience, and the user is not aware that they need to authenticate with the captive portal first. They might run into some issues where the captive portal is waiting to be authenticated. You need to enter some credentials or SMS, those kind of details, but because the user doesn't know where to go, that times out, and then the GP is not connected. So from 6.3, that is also supported. We'll discuss more about captive portal workflow in tomorrow's event. As we were discussing the GP 6.3, although it's a new release, there are some changed behaviors, and there are some new features with 6.3. Your user switch tunnel rename timeout has been increased to 7200 seconds. That's mostly beneficial for RDP sessions, where you don't need or you don't want the tunnel to be renamed once RDP user logs into the system. The GP would generally identify that username and try to rename the tunnel. And if it's not required, then that could cause disconnection. So you can have a longer timeout. Um, the option to connect with SSL only, that just has been renamed. The functionality is still same, but it has been renamed for advanced control for tunnel mode behavior. Tunnel mode indicating that it's for tunnel mode, not for proxy mode. In terms of new feature, there are some new features in 6.3 release, specifically for SAML trusted IP. Embedded browser with captive portal we discussed, smart card enhancement, and there's a multi-authentication CIE experience where if you're using CIE, it used to prompt the user twice for multi-authentication, where with 6.3 it doesn't. Although we should note that the current recommended release is 6.8 and not 6.3. So 6.3 is currently identified as an innovation release which has new features. So if your organization wants to try that out, you can try that out from support portal. You can go to the innovation tab and then try it for a few users. But in terms of the current recommendation release, there is a live page under live community, which shows you what are the recommended releases for PAN-OS as well as GlobalProtect, and that's where 6.8 is the current preferred release. Let's talk about the key takeaways for SAML authentication. So for SAML authentication, we know that you configure IDP for SAML request, and to get the authentication from IDP. It's always best practice to enable the certificate verification so that you verify the SAML request and response and the IDP certificate. For iOS specifically, avoid using always on. So create a different app setting or agent configuration specifically for iOS devices if you use them, either with a different method, or if you're using SAML, then change that to on demand. And for Windows, Mac, disable SSO if you're using SAML. It generally works better. It's by default enabled, but it's recommended to disable SSO for SAML. When you're using cloud authentication service, it can support both the existing SAML functionality, and it just provides you a central way to use the SAML for your Prisma Access deployment along with Prisma Access browser. So you don't have to configure the same you don't have to do same configuration twice just for Prisma Access browser until Prisma Access browser supports different authentication methods. In terms of SAML troubleshooting, as we discussed, that can be tricky sometimes. So whenever a user reports a SAML specific issue, always try to have them reproduce the issue. And before you reproduce the issue, enable the dump logs. Remember, enabling dump logs after the issue has happened will not help, because when you enable the dump log on GP, that's when the GP's logging mode changes and it will start generating more logs. So if the issue has already occurred, changing the logging mechanism will not help. So the best workflow would be you change the logging mode first, change it to dump mode, reproduce the issue. If possible, always take a screen recording just to show what exactly was the issue, and that also helps with the exact timestamp on when was an error message, when did it appear, what was user section, and what generally happened. Then on the IDP side of issues, obviously that is a responsibility of the end organization who is deploying the Prisma Access, or any other. It's true for any vendor. If there are failures on the IDP side, that needs to be taken up with the IDP or with the concerned administrator who manages the IDP story. For default browser issues, because in a default browser, you as a user, you have control. once the authentication prompt goes to the default browser, you can view the page source, and then you can collect the HAR file so that we can see the request SAML request response, which makes it easier and gives us more logs. As when I say us, gives the support or your administrators more logs. You can yourself view the SAML request response. If there are any obvious errors, you would see what's the request response in that HAR file. So it is easier for the administrators as well to view what might be wrong as a first level of troubleshooting. Um, if we are using SAML and if we are using certificate authentication along with it, it's always good to make sure that the username configuration is checked once, because if the certificate profile has a username configuration where you're trying to retrieve username from the certificate profile, that might conflict with what you are getting back from the SAML. So you can just disable that on the certificate profile so that it matches. I mean, there's only one username for the GP to look at, or in another way, you can have both the SAML username and the certificate username format match. If they're matching, then there's no problem because the same username is coming from both the profiles, and that can continue to work. Now let's talk about the override cookies, authenticate cookies. Uh, the primary use of cookies is, at least in Prisma Access world, is to make sure that there is minimum user intervention and the user experience is better. So consider this scenario on a normal on-prem firewall. You would have a single firewall. You've defined your portal there, you've defined your gateway there, and they both are using the same authentication mechanism, but that's only one single firewall where you're using the authentication. Uh, in Prisma Access, your portals would be separate and your gateways would be separate, and gateway locations can be spread across the world. So let's say you're in Singapore and you're connecting to Singapore location, and for whatever reason, for your let's say there are some government sites which allow only local in-country IP, so you need to connect to India for some work, then you need to connect to, say, Australia or US gateways to access their specific websites for a vendor, for a uh, in this case, a user is connecting to different gateways, and authentication cookies here help to make sure the user doesn't have to enter the credentials all the time. The easy explanation for authentication cookie is you connect to portal first. Say as a user, GP connects to the portal. Whatever authentication mechanism they're using, they enter their credentials. Once that's done, the portal will basically create a cookie and encrypt it with the certificate. Then that cookie is passed on to the GP. Then, because you're using the same certificate on the gateways as well, and all the gateways are allowed to accept the cookie. When the GP connects to the gateway, it will first try to send its cookie before the authentication, and because the certificate of the certificate which the portal is using is the same as the gateways can accept that cookie, and then it can decrypt the cookie and let you in. So from users experience, they authenticated to the portal once, then say they connected to Singapore, and now they need to change to India gateway. They just switch over, and then they are connected. They're not asked for authentication again. That all happens because of authentication cookie. Now, in GlobalProtect world, there are multiple authentication cookies. So there is a portal configuration cookie, there is a pre-logon cookie, and there is an authentication cookie. As we discussed, what happens is once your authentication is done to the portal or gateway, your cookie is done, your cookie is generated, and the GP gets the cookie. The important criteria here is that in the tunnel settings, which is referring to gateway, and in the app settings, which is referring to the portal, you should always use the same certificate, because when the cookie is first generated, it is encrypted with the certificate. So if you're using a different certificate on the gateway or on the tunnel settings, you need to use the same certificate. If it is if you're using a separate certificate, then it won't be able to decrypt the cookie and the authentication will fail. And then in terms of the flow, so there are scenarios where the cookie might expire, and if the cookie has expired, then you are no longer able to connect with the authentication cookie, and then there will be an authentication prompt from the gateway or from the portal, wherever you're connecting to. Um, there are some important considerations for cookie lifetime. Again, that depends from organization to organization. Some organizations may want that there should be least user intervention, so they set the cookie lifetime for 30 days. So once you're connected, your cookie is valid for 30 days. Even if you shut down your laptop and you turn it on after 30 days, after say a week, the user is not asked for authentication because the GP has the cookie. It can just send that same cookie to the portal and gateway, and it can connect. Um, Other organizations might focus more on security, so the cookie lifetime is less, say either default 24 hours or maybe just a few hours. There, your cookie authentication works when you authenticate first to the portal and then to gateway, but then it can change. When I say it can change, once the cookie is expired, the user has to authenticate again because the cookie lifetime is lower. Now, in the authentication cookie override, when we are talking about app settings, so the screenshot is for the Strata Cloud Manager. If you're using Panorama to manage Prisma Access, you would see basically these settings in GlobalProtect portal separately under portal authentication and under gateway authentication. So the app settings of SCM corresponds to the portal on the Panorama, and then the tunnel settings corresponds to the gateway on the Panorama world. Um, in the in when we are talking about authentication cookie, there are two configurations which are related. So as you can see here, generate cookie for authentication override, we select the certificate, and do we accept or we don't accept, and then same for the tunnel as well. And then you need to make sure that the either save username or save username and password, one of them is selected so that the GP is able to save the credentials in some form. Now, the cookie lifetime, as we discussed, it can vary from organization to organization depending on what's your requirement. The primary criteria here is that the certificate has to be same. If the certificate is not same, then there is going to be a problem. This authentication cookie mechanism is used for your multi-portal as well. So in Prisma Access, you have the concept of multi-portal where you can have two different um, authentication profiles for your primary portal and secondary portal, and that foundation of that cookie. So without authentication cookie, it will not function properly. Now, if we talk about best practices of authentication cookie, we are talking about using the same certificate. If you're using single sign-on, if that is enabled, the GP would use single sign-on to retrieve the cookie. If it is not, then you need to enable save user credentials. You should always use RS to encrypt and decrypt the cookie and the same certificate. Certificate is configurable, so you can change the certificate criteria in terms of the digest algorithm. And for the authentication cookie, for Panorama, you can have certificate authentication without no profile, still use authentication cookie, but in SCM, you don't have that option. So you'll use a combination of either a user authentication method and certificate, or just user authentication method. Now, on the GP client itself, there are certain locations where you can find the cookie. So this comes in handy when there is a scenario where, let's say, your GP client isn't connecting and you log into the Strata logging service and you view that the authentication is failing because the cookie has expired. But for whatever reason, whenever you try to connect with the GP, it's always trying to use the cookie over and over again, and that keeps failing because that has already expired. So a quick way to get rid of it is you can go to the cookies are saved in .dat format, and there are different cookies. So if you're talking about, if you have a problem with the user authentication cookie, you can see UAC is the user authentication cookie. So you can just take that file, delete that, and then refresh the GP again. So because it doesn't have the cookie, it can't supply the cookie to the gateway to authenticate. And then it will need to create a new cookie. But before you create a new cookie, you need to authenticate. So that authentication mechanism will follow. And then same can be done for the Mac as well. We'll quickly discuss single sign-on as well. So the single sign-on by default is enabled. It's under app settings, or as we say, under GlobalProtect portal app settings. The basics of SSO is that in a environment where the users are logging in with their corporate credentials on a machine, the GP will be able to fetch those credentials and then use those credentials and supply them to the portal and the gateway. So the users don't have to use the same credentials again. Now, as we already discussed, that that's not applicable to SAML, but let's say LDAP or Kerberos, there are the single sign-on would be useful where the users are not really getting prompted to authenticate with the username and password, and SSO is basically able to wrap the third-party credentials, or SSO is able to wrap the credentials and then send it over to the GP so that the GP can authenticate. It's just a single checkbox for the single sign-on. As we said, by default, it is enabled. So if you're using LDAP or normal credential-based username, password, prompt-based authentication mechanism, SSO usually comes in handy. So we already discussed SAML SSO and GPS SSO are two different things. There can be a feel of or a confusion between SSO of IDP and then SSO of GP. As we discussed, when you're using a default browser, your browser has cache and it can have IDP cookies. So when you're authenticating with your IDP separately to GP, and then when you use GP and then the redirection goes to the same browser, your IDP already has cookies, your browser has cookies and cache, and that can authenticate you, but it's not same as the GPSSO. So your configuration here on GPSSO doesn't interfere with that mechanism. And when we are using GlobalProtect SSO, it does retrieve the credentials, but it retrieves username and not with the domain. So the SSO does not cache. So that needs to default configure a LDAP profile. You can define domain there. So whatever your username comes, there is going to be a single domain for all the users. That domain can be configured that profile. For example, if you're using LDAP profile, and then that domain can be appended to the username, and then your authentication can continue, and the logs can match. Logs can match to the domain that you're using. In terms of troubleshooting, we know that we can check the box or uncheck the box on the app settings, but how do you identify if SSO is enabled on the GP client itself? So in the PAN GPS logs, all these are in debug format. So that means that's the by default, that's the default logging level of the GP. So if you generate the GP log bundle, look into the PAN GPS log, and you search for SSO, you would see if SSO is enabled or it is not enabled. Now, it can change depending on which user configuration the GP client is connecting. For example, some organizations have a pre-logon configuration, then a separate user logon configuration. They might have different settings or logon. So depending on which stage you are in, this log would change. But as a in general, in PAN GPS log, you can find out if SSO is enabled and is it being used. And you can see the same in PAN GPA as well. In PAN GPA, what you're seeing, you can see the user one and how did the GP got the username. It was not from the user input, it was from SSO. So the GP they retrieved the username from SSO and then that was used. So that can come in handy when there are issues where the use probably different. Because maybe your organization separate login mechanism or separate username for the user who is logging into the machine, but the GP login is maybe it's your vendor that you're connecting to and that has a separate username password. And but that's failing because GP is using SSO to retrieve your organization's username and then supplying that, which doesn't work. So you can identify that in the PAN GPA log, which username the GP is trying to send or has sent, and what's the type. I mean, it has derived it from SSO or a user input. And then how do you identify the credential saved, which is the save username or password or save username only option portal. So how do you see that in the GP and logs? That you can identify that under PAN GPS log, and was that saved or not saved? We can see that logs. We can see those logs in PAN GPS.log. Another example of SSO with the GP agent where the users are getting prompted for installation. I mean, users are getting prompted for username password after a fresh installation, but the assumption or the requirement of the user was that they should not be because they're using SSO. So one of the factor there is by default it will work because by default say your GPCP or the GlobalProtect credential provider is GP on a system and it can retrieve the username password. But in certain scenarios it is possible that you're using another third party vendor or another credential provider, and if that is the default credential provider, GP won't be able to get the SSO. So in that case, you need to change the registry key to make sure the GPCP or the GP credential provider is your default credential provider, which can help to retrieve your username for SSO. So by default, it will work on most of the machines, but if you are using a different provider, then you need to take care of that as well. We are done for the day one. About multi-portal for Prisma access, how does that work, and enforce kept endpoint traffic policy enforcement scenarios.
All right, that's fantastic. Yeah, we've had a lot of great questions going in the chat, everyone. Thank you very much for putting those in there. We really appreciate it. Ramasamy, great job answering all those questions. Had a question a moment ago about the virtual lab access requests. I've seen over 30 requests come in this evening, or for me this morning, actually. And I will be getting to those requests. The rest of my team and I will be getting to those requests in our morning. We hope to get to it within the first few hours of the morning. But with that many requests, it'll take us a while to get through everybody, just so you're aware. If you're not registered for Fuel, if you use whatever email address you use to sign up for the virtual lab, please be sure that is the email address you used for your Fuel registration. If you don't, you're going to get an email saying, hey, this address isn't in our system. Either re-register or submit your request again. So Yogesh and Ramasamy, thank you very much for everything today. It's been absolutely fantastic. Really looking forward to tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just said thank you, guys.
Oh, of course, absolutely, yeah.